Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on cybersecurity in Southeast Asia. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hemasevich, and I am a program manager at the East-West Center's Washington, D.C. office. The East-West Center is an organization dedicated to fostering better relations and understanding among the peoples of the United States and Asia through programs of cooperative study, training, and research. Part of that research effort is with our RICE program, which is an acronym for the Research, Innovation, and Collaboration Exchange Program, where we partner with experts and organizations to undertake projects that examine relevant issues to U.S. Indo-Pacific relations in new and creative ways. We are excited to be working with Florence Gamboa and Fax Asia on this project on cybersecurity in Southeast Asia. This is a very important project and topic. When you read through the papers associated with this effort, you can see just how interconnected issues of development, economics, personal livelihood, and international security are tied into this cybersecurity efforts of Southeast Asian nations. So this webinar is the second in our four-part series of webinars on cybersecurity in Southeast Asia, along with the relevant papers. And I want to turn it over now to Florence Gamboa to tell you more. Florence?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the series on the state of cybersecurity in Southeast Asia. I've once again been tasked to give a short opening remark, and for those who are joining us here today for the first time, I'd like to share with you the inspiration behind this research project. Our use of technology that makes our lives easier and function better comes with a surge of digital vulnerability. Progress in cyberspace comes with its own challenges. This is a reality that we need to face and a challenge that we need to overcome to properly institutionalize and empower our cybersecurity capabilities, especially in the fast-growing region of Southeast Asia. We are home to many fledgling tech hubs, and with that comes many criminal actors and individuals trying to take advantage of gaps and weaknesses. Building on last week's discussion, we are reminded that cybersecurity has many layers, and that individual, business, and state needs may differ, but also converge on some aspects. The discussion with Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam showed that while Southeast Asian states have begun investing in their national cybersecurity frameworks, strengthening ASEAN cooperation, and engaging with external partners, there's still more to be done and considered given the different capabilities and needs of each state. And this is why this webinar series is important. As much as it is a thought-provoking sharing of ideas and unique experiences in the Southeast Asian region, we also aim to ultimately contribute to building norms among institutions that enhance cybersecurity and expertise to create better strategies to combat cyber vulnerability. The State of Cybersecurity in Southeast Asia project is an initiative of the East-West Center and Fax Asia, launched to bridge gaps and find common ground in uncovering the challenges with experts and state partners like the United States. In the previous webinar, we explored cybersecurity strategies and challenges faced by Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia, highlighting issues such as talent shortages, institutional fragmentation, regulatory gaps, and the need for greater public-private collaboration. The speakers emphasized the importance of pragmatic, country-specific collaboration, stronger regional cooperation, and sustained efforts to harmonize cybersecurity frameworks to build long-term resilience in Southeast Asia amidst rising digital threats. The publication series in last week's webinar can both be found at EWC's Asia Pacific Bulletin and Fax Asia website. Today, we will discuss efforts and experiences of Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Once again, we thank the East-West Center for its generous support and funding and facilitating this timely initiative. Thank you, Zoe and Dr. Nick Hamisevis, for your help. And this project would not have been possible without the EWC's enduring commitment to fostering regional connectivity and intellectual exchange. I would also like to thank the contributors joining us today, Ms. Perlina Said, Mr. Pawi Junwiranon, Dr. Sherwin Ona, and our discussant, Mr. Mark Manantan, for their intellectual generosity and patience throughout the editing process. We hope that this initiative will catalyze further collaboration and knowledge sharing among Southeast Asian nations and their partners. Through collective effort and by leveraging the insights shared in this session, we can move forward for a stronger, safer, and more inclusive digital environment across the region. Again, thank you very much for joining us here today, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Florence. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers to you all. We have Farlina Saeed, is a senior analyst in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program of ISIS Malaysia since 2015. She has led dialogues and forums inclusive of regional and international conversations, such as the Track 1.5 Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific Study Group on International Law and Cyberspace. Her research and ideas have reached forums such as the East Asia Summit workshops, Internet Governance Forum, Singapore International Cyber Week, and platforms on the sidelines of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group. We also have Pawi Janwiranan, is a lecturer in law at the Faculty of Law at Thammasat University in Thailand, and a research affiliate at the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. He has also been working for the World Bank Group since March 2021 as a regulatory specialist for the digital economy. Prior to joining Thammasat University, Pawi was a legal officer at the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the Supreme Court of Thailand, and a part-time researcher at the Thai National Credit Bureau. Sherwin Ona is an associate professor of political science and development studies at De La Salle University. He is also the chairperson of the department and the former associate dean for research and advanced studies of the College of Computer Studies at De La Salle University. Dr. Ona also served as a technical consultant to various government agencies like the Commission on Information and Communication Technology, the Department of Science and Technology, the Commission of Higher Education, the Department of Information and Communications Technology. And in 2019, Dr. Ona was appointed as a consultant of the UN Asia Pacific Center for ICT for Development on data governance and interoperability. Mark Brian Manantan is the Director of Cybersecurity and Critical Technologies at the Pacific Forum in Honolulu, Hawaii. At the forum, he currently leads the U.S. technology and security partnerships with Japan, Australia, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as the Digital ASEAN initiative that focuses on cyber capacity building, artificial intelligence, foreign interference, and space diplomacy. He is also the host of the Pacific Forum's official podcast, The Indo-Pacific Current. Mr. Manantan is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at National Chengchi University in Taiwan, and formerly a research consultant at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was a media, public relations, and advertising executive for Procter & Gamble, Wells Fargo, Aboitiz Equity Ventures, and UNICEF. So as you can see, we have a great panel for you, and we're looking forward to all the remarks. And we'd like to start off with Farlina Saeed. Farlina, please start us off.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the very generous introduction. So I'm actually just going to cover a few things, which is perhaps the history of Malaysia's cybersecurity. So we actually understand where these philosophical thinkings are actually coming when Malaysia actually tends to look at cybersecurity issues. Also significant laws, because I think some of the laws that actually serves as the backbone of how we actually end up governing or actually addressing some of the various security issues in this space would actually be quite important. Also, when it comes to priorities, or what I view the priorities the country is actually putting forth as things that they're actually going to work forwards. And lastly, are the key takeaways. I think that's probably like all the thoughts, the random thoughts I actually do have when it comes to some of these areas. So if I do miss anything, please don't hesitate to actually just put it in the Q&A or to just like nudge me on any of this. So Some parts about the history, I suppose, because Malaysia's intention to actually develop the multimedia super corridor actually started in the 1990s. Some of the laws and regulations actually emerged during the time, such as the Communications and Multimedia Act, which was launched in 1998, which was actually and it was followed by the Personal Data Protection Act in 2010. So something that's actually quite significant for Malaysia when we actually do look at cybersecurity, it started out as a very IT specific issue. And when it actually becomes an IT specific issue, it can actually be quite technical. And the first priority is actually in protecting the critical infrastructure. And that's what you actually get in the National Cybersecurity Policy in 2008. So as years went by, of course, you actually have different types of issues that actually come from cyberspace. And also you actually have various data protection issues, privacy issues, online harms. And this is actually where you actually got the significant laws update in 2024. So prior to that, we actually had the CMA 1998, which is the Communications and Multimedia Act 1998, that actually outlined various types of misuse of ICT networks. We had the PDPA, which is the Data Protection Act 2010. But unfortunately, PDPA actually introduces the principles and the guidelines, but it doesn't actually have any form of strict enforcement in terms of like data breach requirements. So in 2024, which was last year, there were actually up to 4 laws two were updated, 2 were introduced. One is the Cybersecurity Act. Another that was introduced is the Online Safety Act, and the PDPA, the Data Protection Act, as well as the Communications and Multimedia Act were updated. So I'll just actually glance through some of the updates and the significant points that these make. Because cybersecurity can actually be a very multi-agency area, it can be very difficult for governments to actually coordinate, especially when you have different types of agencies enforcing different things. So the Cybersecurity Act actually clearly highlights and outlines who should actually be deciding most of the cybersecurity standards. And also it actually it allows the government to, the cybersecurity agency to decide which one is the critical infrastructure or who is a critical infrastructure. Because prior to this, you may actually get certain members who perhaps in your mind is like, oh, that electrical company should be a critical infrastructure, but they may not actually see themselves as such. So in that sense, the Cybersecurity Act actually empowers the cybersecurity agency to do that. The Online Safety Act, on the other hand, actually highlights the different types of harms that could actually impact users' experience online. So this goes all the way from CSAM, or child sexual abuse material, to fraud, to different types of violent images. And this actually talks about the different types. It sets a baseline, I think, of what platforms, how platforms should actually respond to some of these online safety issues. The PDPA update finally actually introduced the data breach requirements. So it actually has a couple of it actually required also for businesses to actually to hire a data protection officer. And this is quite significant because Malaysia is up to 80 to 90% SMEs. And that means you actually have your mom and pop stores who actually perhaps do not have who are actually quite used to handling sensitive or personal information, but they may actually not know what is the proper data protection standards. So in that sense, the PDPA actually tells, even if you're a mom and pop store, you have to have somebody who is actually responsible for data protection. So if the government actually checks on your data protection practices, you may actually be liable. But I think later on, when they actually introduce the guidelines, there's actually certain thresholds that you actually have to meet before you actually have to be audited, or before you actually some of these are actually enforced. Lastly, when it comes to the Communications and Multimedia Act, it's actually updated for certain things that if you notice, Southeast Asia is actually facing on a lot of scam issues. So Communications and Multimedia Act update actually aims to address that and actually clarify some of the languages when you actually see with the misuse. So that's actually a whole bunch of laws. I hope I actually didn't confuse anyone. I'm actually going to go with the priorities now. I think, as mentioned earlier, as you can tell with 2024 update, fraud is actually something that's regarded as a serious issue. And it's actually something that was highlighted in the Online Safety Act as a priority harmful content, meaning that if a platform actually finds it, they will actually have to take it down really quickly. The second part is actually the priority is actually in finding a way to get platforms to comply. So over here, there is actually the social media regulation framework, which was introduced. And this actually tries to get platforms to be licensed. But as we know, a lot of these things are actually cross-jurisdictional. So it's actually very difficult to enforce. Third is actually protecting critical infrastructure, because critical infrastructure still serves as the priority when Malaysia actually looks at cybersecurity issues. Because if your electricity company actually goes down, for instance, that's going to be problematic for a lot of people. Lastly is actually in emerging technologies like AI. So AI late last year, Malaysia actually launched the National AI Office, of which they have to have 7 deliverables this year, among which is actually to look at legal frameworks and to actually see whether law is required. So some things before we actually think, oh yeah, this is wonderful, we actually have a lot of laws in place, so perhaps everything is would actually be kept to, it would be enforced. Unfortunately, there are actually gaps between regulation and practice. And in that sense, it comes when there are a lot of basic practices like with data management, with cybersecurity, that are actually not met. Enforcement is a challenge because you actually do find that human resources human resources is actually a challenge for all the government agencies. And lastly, when it comes to addressing emerging technologies and developing technologies, for instance, quantum, how do we actually address the rollout of quantum, especially when you have encryption issues that could actually crop up in the future? And also AI, when you're actually looking at it from a cybersecurity perspective, but actually also from an online safety perspective. So these are actually some of the things that I would actually raise as a baseline that Malaysia is going through. When I do look forward to any interaction after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fralina. Pawi, please.
Okay, so I think I would like to wrap up here that actually the situation in Thailand is not quite different from the situation in Malaysia and perhaps in other Southeast Asia countries as well. So from the situation of the cybersecurity in Thailand, I would say that Thailand actually has made significant progress in building this cybersecurity and digital infrastructure in the past few years, in the past many years actually, backed by strong law. We do have like the Cybersecurity Act as well, and the Personal Data Protection Act or PDPA, and several sector-specific regulations. So, but I think one big lesson is that having laws like the Cybersecurity Act and the PDPA is important, but that is only part of the picture, because enforcement and coordination across sectors still need improvement in Thailand. And I would say that another point is that one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work. Actually, all Thai authority, like I think the government as well, we know that actually there are like how we should improve the domestic laws and regulations to meet the international standard in relation to cybersecurity, data protection, AI governance, and other issues. But I think different sectors also, such as banking, energy, and healthcare, actually face different type of cyber risks. So our cybersecurity strategy also needs to be more flexible and also context specific. In terms of international relationship, Thailand also has learned the value of balancing its partnership with other leading country or more advanced country in the world. And actually, from my opinion, what should Thailand do next? I would say that it would be helpful to create a more unified legal framework. It like but you need to take into account all the domestic and local context of the country, because we have like the different government structure, and we have the different laws and regulations that we already put in place. But we also need to be aware of the other local context, and also to raise awareness and also to educate like private and public sector to understand on the same page. And also right now we have, as I have mentioned, we have several laws covering different aspects of cybersecurity and pulling them together into something more cohesive, and that could help business and regulators as well. And I think we need to strengthen our cybersecurity workforce. This means that investing in training program, professional certification, and partnership with, for example, university and the private sector. I think it is also worth encouraging like all the sectors to come together and also to work together in this cybersecurity issue as well. And I think Thailand need first unified cybersecurity policy framework and stronger public and private partnership and more investment in workforce development. It also need to boost cyber literacy at all levels and ensure consistent enforcement across sector. And I think international cooperation will be essential because actually from my experiences, many projects that we also got support from the international organization like the World Bank Group and other international bodies, and that help us a lot in strengthening our policy framework for these cybersecurity issues. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate that. Sherwin, please.
Thank you, Nick. First of all, let me thank our organizers, East West Center and PAX Asia, for the invitation, and allow me to greet my fellow panelists and our participants. Good morning to everyone. Greetings from Manila. I'll now share my slides. I just have 3 slides. Here you go. I hope you can see it now. My paper is titled "The Cybersecurity Option for the Philippines: Adopting a Cyber Defense Posture." Now, many ask me, Sherwin, what do you think of the Philippines in terms of its cybersecurity uh, competence? Um, Basically, if you look at the Philippines, similar to what my fellow panelists mentioned, we have laws, we have the Data Privacy Act, we have a Cyber Crime Act, and all of these strategic plans that highlights the important milestones in building a country's cybersecurity readiness or competence. But in case of the Philippines, which I labeled as a curious case, when the current administration, the Marcos administration, pivoted towards the United States and its Western allies, began experiencing significant number of cyber attacks. And these are all deliberate attacks targeting our national police, our National Bureau of Investigation, our social agencies like the National Health Insurance and our Statistics Office. There's also a significant effort to attack the armed forces of the Philippines and the office of the president. This is a year-long attack that was described in a Bloomberg news article. Then I labeled this as a curious case because aside from these cyber attacks, it seems that this is combined with a very deliberate, very organized disinformation campaign. And all of these, we believe, are tied up to what's happening in our maritime territories, because when we started to impose or started to argue about our rights in our maritime territories, what we call the West Philippine Sea, we started to experience not only attacks in our maritime space, but also in our cyberspace. A notable event also is the presence of malign influence operations, usually emanating from cyberspace. And active law enforcement in the last 2 years have revealed that many of these online gaming organizations are, engaged in disinformation and deliberate cyber attacks against government institutions and agency. We believe that this is a sampling of our adversary's sharp power. Now, in my paper, I opted to present a way forward. I term this way forward as, uh, you know, uh, a comprehensive defense posture, a cyber defense posture, which uses the idea of passive and active defense. Now, when we say passive defense, this is what we usually refer to in cybersecurity as the castle principle, where organizations build their firewalls, adopt administrative controls, and physical security. In some cases, organizations would adopt disaster recovery measures. And of course, this is where I think the Philippines should be investing on the capability of adopting active cyber defense, which entails, for example, the monitoring of adversaries and criminals, sharing of threat assessment and best practices, identification of critical infrastructure and knowledge resources is very crucial at this point because in the Philippines, we still have to come up with a list of critical information resources and infrastructure that needs to be defended in case of an APT, an advanced persistent threat. Although our national cybersecurity plan would prescribe the development of standards, but the challenge here is the implementation. Because yes, it is written in our plan, but organizations, especially in the private sector, would have their own standards, their own processes, and their own supply chains that are often owned by these organizations. They refuse to share. Okay. Well, further on, in my paper, I floated the idea of different facets. I specifically cited the idea of offensive cyber operations, which forms part of a deterrence strategy in terms of cyber security, meaning that states, particularly those who are in the receiving end of cyber attacks, should have the capability to conduct offensive cyber operations. What do you mean by this? States can, of course, have the option to hack back, very similar to what the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western countries are doing. They're basically stopping these malign attacks from its source. It can also be characterized by the sharing of information, both locally and internationally. My fellow panelists highlighted the importance of international cooperation. Deterrence, that is part of deterrence strategy. Aside from having, of course, the legal and diplomatic initiatives. I also highlighted the importance of resilience, the importance of organizations being able to revert back to normal operations, being able to adopt continuity practices, and the need to establish baselines. And small economies like the Philippines should be active in establishing norms in cyberspace. It should have a stronger voice in global settings like the United Nations, for instance, and advocate for more transparency and more cooperation in terms of cybersecurity, especially in dealing with state-initiated or non-state-initiated malign activities. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
Thank you, Sherwin. Really appreciate it. And I would encourage everyone to read these papers. They're really good, giving this information for everyone. And now I would like to turn over to Mark for his discussing ideas. Mark, please.
Thank you very much to all our wonderful speakers, and it's really nice to see old and familiar faces in the call, as well as in the list of all the attendees and participants. Before I give my intervention, I'd like to thank the East-West Center for the very kind invitation to participate and read through some of the great articles that are coming up or have been published at the Asia Pacific Bulletin. I think in the next 10 minutes, what I will do is just to offer a couple of observations, I think based on the remarks that were made by the three speakers based on their research analysis. And I'll just end with a couple of potentially future forward-looking implications and some of the gaps that I think I see, and also what are some of the next steps that not only Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand can do, but also collectively in Southeast Asia. I think across the three speakers, there is really a huge emphasis on the concept of regulation. So I'll start with here. And regulation in terms of the different Cybersecurity Act that was mentioned, as well as on the Personal Data Protection Act. And I think this is emblematic and also symbolic and pragmatic approach that recognizes that a lot of Southeast Asian countries are indeed maturing in terms of their digital economy. And these legislations are indeed very pertinent to protect critical national infrastructure, to ensure that the delivery of social services, as well as financial transactions that cut across borders are secure, safe, and transparent. We also heard from the speakers, from the experts, about this very context-specific and sectoral approach in cybersecurity. I'm very, very encouraged and heartened to hear this concept or notion of context-specific. And back in the day, 10 years ago, there would be very few. Let me just highlight the contribution of this project and the work that we've also been doing in Pacific Forum, the community in Southeast Asia, that 10 years ago, you wouldn't see as many faces from the region writing about cybersecurity about the region. And so the selection itself of the speakers in this particular project speaks volumes about the importance of context, as well as a more of the tailored approach in understanding the region, not just from a very top level policy perspective, but also from the on the ground experience of these experts that are convening today. And I think that lends itself to context specific approach, which requires harmonization. How do we bridge domestic priorities or domestic laws with the international obligations and frameworks? And here we have the issue of how do we really operationalize international frameworks such as the UN UN framework of responsible state behavior, comprising international norms, the 11 UN cyber norms, and also the application of international law in cyberspace. And so I think that's really a contentious issue that we observe between or across the 3 countries that were covered in the second iteration of this virtual seminar. I think we also heard about public-private partnership, and in the case of Thailand and also in Malaysia, I think there is really that emphasis on the role of the government, the private sector, and also the academia in fostering a collaborative environment to produce graduates and also workforce that would attend to the increasing number of cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. But also what comes with that is the cognizance that there is an increasing, still a prevailing trust deficit between the private sector and also the government in terms of information sharing and incident response or threat response. And I think the third observation is, as you've observed through the 3 speakers, cybersecurity, as much as it's a digital issue, as much as it's a domestic issue, it's still a foreign policy issue. And it's very distinct how Malaysia and Thailand have positioned so far, at least from the point of view of Fardina and Pawi, about their perspective in terms of a very digital economy, balancing it with their national security interest. But we've heard from Dr. Sherwin Ona that the Philippines, I think, although digital economy is still very much a priority, being second to India in terms of business process outsourcing, I think because of the current geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea, the country's cybersecurity posture has tended towards more of a strategic edge in terms of active defense or active cyber defense or passive cyber defense. And I'm quite intrigued about his idea of offensive cyber capabilities, particularly in the context of the Philippines. So I think in the last 5 minutes, I think I'll just end with a couple thought-provoking questions or insights that I throw in, not just to the speakers, but I think to our very wonderful audience who are tuned in across the world. I think the first one is, when we talk about cybersecurity regulation, we should also think about the political will that politicians have in terms of really backing up this cybersecurity law, PDPA, Online Safety Act, and all these other regulations that we have. How much political bandwidth is the current government and administration is really willing to push in terms of really making this laws and regulations enforceable, not just in terms of political blessing, but also in terms of the resources that the government will invest in these regulations to make them happen. Secondly, again, cybersecurity as a team sport, meaning it's not just about the government mandating the private sector to share information or raise their cyber resilience, but also private sector, the industry will always ask, what's in it for us, right? It's about the incentives for the private sector to really implement your NIST cybersecurity framework, to comply with the ISO 27001. And at the end of the day, even in the ASEAN family, I think a lot of us in this call would agree that ASEAN, whenever it implements a policy, how does it add to the bottom line of trade and economic development? In terms of what was mentioned about international diplomacy, I think I will just raise this provocative question, that in this day and age where we're seeing the United States retreat from providing aid, from providing support for key organizations that are conducting capacity building, should Southeast Asia start to think about its own self-help capacity building initiatives? And I think we're waking up to the reality in this day and age that Southeast Asia, I would commend, there are so many initiatives within the ASEAN family. We have Singapore and Malaysia, of course, and Thailand leading the charge in building cyber capacity within the ASEAN family. But it also poses the question about the sustainability of funding that allows civil society organizations to really raise technical, legal, and policy capacity. And I think the the third one before the last, the penultimate factor before the last one, I think context. We talk about context. And as much as I would I'd appreciate the concepts that comes from the UK, from the United States, of course, I think majority of the laws and regulations and even cyber strategies in Southeast Asia are still very much aligned to what the developed economies or the advanced economies have been doing. And take, for example, the PDPA landscape in the region, which is very much shaped or influenced by the GDPR due to the trade and economic relationship of Southeast Asia with Europe, for instance. As far as attribution or cyber capability is concerned, is it really wise for Southeast Asia to start thinking about offensive cyber capabilities? Or is it better and strategic for countries like the Philippines to calculate first and have a recalibrated approach in terms of its cybersecurity posture, considering the power asymmetry it has with the other cyber great powers in the region? Once again, congratulations to the East-West Center for this fabulous and fantastic work. I look forward to the next installment of this project, and I'm very much very appreciative of all of your wonderful remarks, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that. So we're going to just have a little conversation here with our panelists, but if you have any questions for them, please put them in the question and answer chat, and we can ask them as well as we go along. So please go ahead and start doing that. One of the ones I wanted to pick up on was what Mark was talking about as far as like the continuity of these policies, kind of through administrations and through time in the government. And so for Farlina, Pawi, and Sherwin, for the countries you were looking at, how much is there? Is it as far as this continuity of these laws and policies and sort of strategies that these countries have for cybersecurity? And is it sort of an aspect of that they're solid and we're just going to keep them? And then there's still this issue, like you talked about, where they're not being implemented. They're there, but they're not kind of being implemented. Or is it a different sort of aspect of continuity? So, Farlene, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Sure. So I think the impact of politics on regulation in Malaysia is that passing a law in Malaysia is actually quite tough. You actually do have to wait for things to either be at the right moment. For instance, I think if you had a significant cybersecurity issue, if you have a significant scam issue, then all of a sudden you can actually justify redirecting budgets to, say, forming institutions to addressing scams and things like that. So the Cybersecurity Act, for instance, has been in the works for a while, but it had to wait for the right moment and the right champion for the law to actually be pushed forward. And it's actually also the same with PDPA. So underlying all this is that cybersecurity is very, very important. I think so far, like since the 1990s, it has actually been very important for the agencies to actually be able to do their jobs, to actually conduct either the audits or to respond to reports. But sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, the problem with enforcement is that you actually need the budget to actually scale up your body so that, say, if you have a personal data protection department with 30 people, you may actually need to scale it up to 60 or 100 because you're actually looking at data protection enforcement for the entire nation. So I think those type of things are where it actually becomes very difficult. So I think in terms of interest, the law will not scale back. There are certain areas of the law which could be contentious, which can be scaled back. For instance, content management. For instance, we had a history where we had the Anti-Fake News Act, of which it was actually passed very quickly, and then it was also repealed just as quickly. So in those kind of situations, you in content management and moderation, there can actually be different responses if you actually look at that in terms of like the whole entire safety and cybersecurity landscape. But if you're looking at like technical cybersecurity, it usually tends to go in one direction, and that's the way forward.
Any other panelists want to mention anything?
Yeah,
sure.
Nick,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I absolutely agree with what Farlina said about the importance of laws, and I believe that laws are indeed crucial in at least addressing current threats in terms of cybersecurity. However, I have my misgivings about laws because they tend to address the current situation. And as you know, in cyber, the changes often very fast. And sometimes these laws become obsolete. In the Philippines, we have, several laws that were enacted to address a certain digital crime, but after a few years, they're not useful anymore. So I think laws are needed, but governments should be agile enough to realize that these are evolving threats. And or perhaps a good example would be how will you now enact laws to address, for instance, AI enabled cyber attacks? I mean, we don't know yet what it looks like, but we know that it's going to happen. So that's my doubt with regards to laws. But it should not deter governments from enacting one, but we should be agile enough. Thank you.
Great. How is, Mark kind of mentioned it as well, and we mentioned it there too. How is the budget process for your countries on cybersecurity, the countries you're looking at? And is it seen as a priority in the budget process? We talked about a little bit about this last week, where you have these policies or you have some things that they want to implement, but the budget's just not there. So how about that? What does that look like?
I can try to take a crack at it, although I probably wouldn't actually have it in such details, because I also know that, say, the agencies are actually able to put forth, say, their wish list and things like that, and whether it's actually granted when they actually do try to table it to budget, it can be trimmed, it can be achieved. I think some of the difficult parts is that budget always actually has to consider different priorities, and I think in Malaysia, the narratives actually go into which is the chicken and which is the egg. Is the cybersecurity the chicken, or is e-commerce the chicken, the egg, technically? And then, or you're actually looking at the digital economy. So if people are actually looking at cybersecurity, they're actually thinking, okay, if you don't actually have substantive enough economic activities, then there might not be a justification for you to actually amp up on certain investments in cybersecurity, for instance. So that's actually where some of the considerations are. And if we actually notice like the budgets for cybersecurity, even as I actually notice it being tabled at the end of the year, let's say if you actually get it in 1 year, 2022, maybe 2023, you would actually get, it'll be a slimmer or trimmer budget. Then as it goes to 2024, it actually really depends. It depends because 2024, to be fair, we actually also had like 4 laws, of which like there actually had to be significant investments, I think, in some of the, at least personnel, in some of the technical capabilities. So that's actually some of the considerations, I think, when we actually look at the budgets. In all honesty, the waves have not been consistent. I don't think it's been like, okay, every single year, like cybersecurity actually gets a slice of the pie. And some years it is actually missing from the pie. And you notice that there's actually greater emphasis on, say, building digital infrastructure, perhaps, or greater efforts to digitize your SMEs. So that's actually part of the, I think, debate that you actually have here. I hope that helps in a way.
I think I can add something in Thailand as well. I think budget allocation is the problem here in Thailand because so many authorities here they want to spend sometimes like cybersecurity training program or initiative, but they work like in parallelly, how to say, but they sometimes it's like overlapping. And also I think the way that they manage the budget is also not efficient enough. And also, is this because of the governmental bodies in Thailand? I think there are authorities that actually they have like the overlapping duties and roles. For example, we have the Electronic Transaction Development Agency, that the agency under the Ministry of Digital, that is like their duties under the law is quite broad compared to other specific agencies. And sometimes it's also they launch so many initiatives like AI governance, data sharing. But we also have the PDPC under the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Committee under the Ministry of Digital as well. And we also have the other authorities that sometimes we have like the same or like they share the common duties, and they haven't coordinate each other to run any kind of programs. And sometimes they set the special committee, and they like have the special committee have the representative from different authorities. But I think that is not enough, because in that case you need to set up the special committee in all the initiative that you want to launch in the future. And I think sometimes they spend the best budget like not that efficient. I think that is also the problem of the budget allocation in Thailand. And I think not just only the overlapping on the so many initiatives, but in Thailand we have the problems of the government open data as well. That is also make the budget allocation is quite difficult sometimes. For example, we have the budget for SME, but this authority also give to the same SME, like, and that authority as well. But yeah, because we don't have the platform for data sharing, and also that is also the make it difficult for the authorities in Thailand as well, that they haven't know, they cannot know that this SME already got fund from the different authorities, and this happened many times during many years.
And Nick, if I may quickly add to the point of Piwe and Farlina, I think we have similar concerns, right? And although budgets are always controversial, it's not zero, it's there. But I think the greater question would be, how will you now spend it? If you're doing a digital transformation project, what will be your priority, efficiency or security? And this is always a concern when agencies are implementing their digital transformation projects. They tend to look at it in a very siloed, very, what do you call this? It's just my agency, and I don't really, mind data sharing and other collaborative mechanisms that a whole of nation or a whole of government cybersecurity would entail. That is the reason why in my paper I kept on proposing this defense posture, this cyber defense posture, because when you give money to cybersecurity, yes, you need to protect your organization, you need to protect your data, but it also asks you the question, what will be your role in the greater scheme of things? In the security of the whole government system, for instance. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Interesting stuff. So we have a lot of good questions coming in and in the Q&A. And so a couple questions on critical infrastructure. So we've talked about this throughout the conversation. How are the countries you're looking at trying to decide what countries to partner with on what specific critical infrastructures they want to do? So one thing that people are looking at are undersea cables as an aspect. but other things that are classified as critical infrastructure, how are the countries you're looking at really trying to figure out where to partner with and what to work on within these critical infrastructures?
Okay, so I'm not a good expert on undersea cables because I think there's actually a lot that I can still actually learn from, especially because also in Malaysia, the jurisdiction for the undersea cable actually runs through different ministries. For instance, Ministry of Transport is one, and then actually also it looks at the Ministry of Communications. So there are actually like certain jurisdiction I think overlaps when it comes to something like that. But I think some of the experiences, say, if we're actually looking at 5G infrastructure and how Malaysia actually decided for some of the options, there were considerations and I think there were assessments, and I think there were also because Malaysia is a developing nation, and sometimes you actually have different considerations when you think about budgets and where you actually put. I think that's actually been the theme or the discussion even prior in the previous questions. The only thing that I think Malaysia could actually do is ensure that the security standards throughout the infrastructure is actually kept to a higher standard. So in that sense, if it actually has to harmonize with international standards, if it actually has to pick up the standards from international organizations, or if it actually could learn from the practices from other countries, that would be the best way for you to actually ensure that the entire infrastructure supply chain is actually of a good security standard. So deciding there can be many factors. There can actually be consideration, economic, commercial factors that would actually be one of the weigh-ins. It can actually also certain subtle factors that may not be considered is that if some of the discussions are actually being propagated by private sector, then who these private sector actually regard as their partners actually also become an important component when they're actually deciding who builds the entire infrastructure. And that's actually where you find that it's not really sometimes a G2G, it's sometimes a B2B or a G2B kind of like arrangement. So those are actually some of the considerations I think when we actually do think about digital infrastructure. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. There's also a question about kind of the thought that maybe sometimes there's a struggle with real-time threat intelligence about cybersecurity threats, and question about what mechanisms are needed to be developed or improved to have some regionally integrated real-time cyber threat intelligence sharing, or just sort of a better handle of real-time threats for the countries.
No, I can answer that, Nicholas. Intelligence sharing is very important. In fact, in the Philippines, we are a beneficiary of this information from our traditional allies like the United States, Canada, and Australia. So we really benefit from this. But the question is, when we get actionable intelligence, what do we do with it? So for I can speak of some of the updates in national security. Our armed forces, for instance, is trying to build its cyber defense capabilities through by establishing a cyber command. There's a lot of recently the president has issued an executive order, for instance, asking all government agencies in the executive side to cooperate with one another to form some common standards and practices that can increase the cyber resilience of our public agencies and institutions. So more or less, given these actionable intelligence, there are some policy efforts and even organizational efforts in the Philippines that would respond to these trends. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mark, you have a hand up comment.
Yeah, I think just to respond to this, and I'll be more of a concrete and tangible initiatives that we have now and potentially ways to forward. I think, for instance, we have the ASEAN CERT that's being currently established, being formed as one of the key initiatives under the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy 21 to 25. 2021 to 2025, this is something that Malaysia and of course Singapore are highly supportive of to really improve the threat intelligence sharing and also incident or threat response among Southeast Asian countries, moving from a very conceptual to more of a pragmatic approach. We also have the Asia Pacific CERT, which encompasses not just the Southeast Asian countries, but also a lot of our neighbors in Northeast Asia, as well as in Oceania. And this is really a constellation of computer and emergency response teams across my CERT for Malaysia, CERT PH, I think for the Philippines, and for forgive me, Pawi Kothot for I cannot recall at this moment the CERT of Thailand. And I think thirdly, there are public-private partnerships that are currently existing in terms of developing threat intelligence. So you have the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Program that I think is also very active in Southeast Asia. I myself, as a senior advisor to this new organization called CI-ISAC International, that has a mission to build sovereign threat sharing capabilities within Southeast Asia. And I think lastly, what really undergirds this question of threat intelligence is more than the technical aspect. I think what's important in the threat intelligence sharing landscape is the human-to-human connection. And majority, for instance, of the AP CERT community have been successful and continues to do so despite the geopolitical tensions in the region because of the community that a lot of these CERT professionals have built over time throughout their interaction. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Picking up on that, one of the kind of conversations we had last week and a little bit here too is, especially with cybersecurity, how much do you say publicly, oh, this was attacked, or we're having this attack, or we have this issue, versus kind of keeping it to yourself, plugging that vulnerability up and keeping it quiet. For the strategies and laws that we've been talking about for your countries, where do you see that sort of dynamic with your countries as far as they're trying to say things publicly or trying to plug things up privately?
I can add to that, Nick. In the Philippines, there is this proposed law on critical infrastructure, which addresses that concern that you mentioned, because currently organizations, especially those who belong to the sensitive industries like banks, telecoms, are very reluctant to share information because, one, because of legal ramifications, two, because of its effects to its brand. We have seen this happening in banks, where banks would say that, there is some sort of, accounts holiday, a 3-day holiday and stuff. And we suspect that this is, a cyber attack against this bank. But banks, because of their very, traditional nature, would refrain from sharing these information. So I think policies such as this law that I mentioned, or even regulations in terms of its sector, like the banking sector, should open spaces where these entities could share critical information and absolve them from any legal ramification. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Farlina, you have your hand up there.
So I think to add to what Dr. Sherwin has actually raised, definitely trust is actually the significant part, I think, of cybersecurity, but also at the same time, we find that we're actually in this like sliding slope. If you actually choose to declare or and say something has actually happened, then you're worried that you actually lose the trust. So I think just to expand some of the discussion that was actually raised by Dr. Sherwin, there are actually two circumstances that I see. One is actually the one where the government actually regulates the private sector. So in the sense, like in Malaysia, the personal data protection updates actually actually also included data breach notification guidelines, which actually says that, okay, if you actually manage up to 20,000 personal data of Malaysians, or if you're actually managing 10,000 personal data, sensitive data for Malaysians, if something happens in to their data, you are actually required to actually notify them. And they actually tell you explicitly what are the steps of notification that you have to go through. The second bit is actually about what if the government is actually the ones who were being attacked? What if the government is what if it's actually government systems? Because we actually also know that government is actually like the biggest data pool that you actually find. That's like a lake or the ocean itself for a nation, right? So in that sense, there is that balance, and I feel like from the trends that I've actually seen with Malaysia, you may actually get notifications, it would actually be declared. But sometimes I also find that sometimes there are certain the messaging is always everything is fine, it will be managed. So there is actually that possibility that the danger or the concerns could be underplayed. So those are, I think, some of the circumstances which actually is quite difficult to answer, because with the government, I think as a citizen, you don't really have a choice, but sometimes to actually share your information, technically that's actually how you get the government services, right? The private sector, to a certain extent, maybe you can actually find like different types of options, but you also need like the ecosystem, like data portability laws, for instance, if you actually want to move some of these like ideas, some of your services from one platform to the next. So just some thoughts.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we had from the chat was, what strategic approaches can Southeast Asia nations collectively adopt to bolster their digital sovereignty and minimize the reliance on foreign technology that pose some embedded cyber risks, particularly when they're trying to balance US-China issues alongside all the other aspects that we've been talking about?
That's a difficult question, Nick. And I'll try to give my 5 cents word of that. The 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 basic concern usually is what is your national interest, right? I mean, in case of the Philippines, it's highly contextual because we have experienced a lot of digital attacks over the past 3 years. But that doesn't say that that doesn't mean that we need to isolate ourselves and be beholden to our the usual allies like the United States, Canada, and Australia, and the United Kingdom. I think there is also a concern to balance it. We cannot really attribute all of these attacks to a single state, and it's better not to isolate yourself. um I mean, opening diplomatic avenues, or even discussions with potential adversaries, like in our case, China. I think this is more of a positive approach, right? At the onset, of course, China would say that all of these attacks are criminal, and they absolutely condemn it. I think we can start from there, and we can use this opening really to further cooperation and not really to isolate a country. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Farlene, I think you want to comment as well?
Yeah, if it's actually okay. So actually, I really love the note that Dr. Sherwin actually ended on. I think it's like sometimes it's really wonderful if cybersecurity incidences actually become a form or a basis for cooperation, because that's like the purpose of the norms of responsible state behavior. But I guess, offering some considerations when it comes to cyber sovereignty, we do have challenges when you actually look at manufacturing and industrial capabilities, or even like talent capabilities when you look at specific sectors in Malaysia, because there could be instances in the past where you may have actually, or we may have actually tried to build indigenous technologies, but ended up actually utilizing a lot of resources. And actually it doesn't come to full fruition because some of these actually includes a lot of R&D, and that's actually where some of the concerns are when we actually do think about trying to build our own versus actually adopting and actually making sure that the standards are actually quite high for the technologies that we actually adopt and put into our systems. I think the second part is that if you look into our Data Protection Act, in the beginning, like the 2010 version actually had a whitelist specification, meaning that you can only transfer the data to whitelist countries. But they actually realized that it's actually very difficult to enforce and implement. So, and I think currently it's more towards a blacklist type of approach, meaning that you actually do have to take a look at the security levels of the country that you're planning to store your data, because that is actually where the concerns are. So it's less of a data sovereignty, but more towards a data residency types of, I think that's the word, this data residency type of approach. You have to know exactly where it is, the security levels, every single place where it actually passes through, and that's actually for all the high security data that you actually get from government or that's used by government. So I think I think to answer this, some things that would be interesting is actually when it comes to emerging technologies, if we're looking at AI, for instance, because there are certain things that's actually within the AI stack that can actually complement the types of industries you have in Southeast Asia. For instance, semiconductors. So you can actually start even from hardware. And then if you're actually looking at the different LLM efforts by Singapore, for instance, you can actually see that there can be potential, inclusive of, I think like Vietnam has different types of efforts to bring to raise their AI to raise their AI industrial environment as well. So I think there are some parts of the newer technologies which could be hopeful, but also at the same time, R&D is still very expensive. Perhaps with AI, it's actually not so much if we actually know how the stack works. But if we're actually looking at other technologies, for instance, like quantum, that can, I mean, it's like some countries in the region, like Singapore, has invested like billions over the past decade, which are billions that perhaps Malaysia doesn't have. So those are things that we do have to think about. Maybe pick and choose the technology that you actually want to build the cyber sovereignty. Be very smart about it, because you know that every cent that you're putting into that R&D is actually a cent that you're actually taking away from a farmer, not, or maybe somebody who's actually going to use it for e-commerce. So that's actually some of the challenges that we would face.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments people have? Great. Is there any aspect to kind of the fraud, you know, from you talked about the fraud, and is it mostly kind of stealing, or is it just the kind of fake news aspect as well to things? Or are those kind of seen as two separate issues, fraud versus fake news and fake information or false information?
Okay, so that's actually an interesting question, and I don't know whether you're actually saying whether some of the whether the criminals have actually tried to use fake news to actually lure, bait, or like conduct phishing campaigns, and I think they have. I don't know whether, I think also the definition of fake news can actually be quite fluid. So I mean, it's like if you actually were to impersonate the website of a government official, then or a government body, then I'm pretty sure that's not fake news. But if it links back to some of these like websites, then perhaps that could actually be part of it. But I think a clearer answer in regards to regulations is that it is actually specified quite differently. For instance, the CMA, when it was actually writing all the different types of explanations for content, which is actually the section 233, if I'm not mistaken. So when it actually states every single thing, fake news would actually be under those types of explanations. Where if you're actually looking at fraud, you actually have very explicit, I think, explicit statements in, say, the Online Safety Act that actually talks about it. These actually try to it does actually identify both as actually a serious issue for the country. It may not actually be seen as of the same scale. I think fraud is definitely seen at a higher scale. It's considered a priority, I think, only because the losses to some of the people have been quite great. Yeah, so in that sense, it is both is actually identified, but not but different, explicitly differently in the legislation?
I have a different answer for that, Nick, and with due respect to Farlina,
Yes.
in my paper, I tend to combine both, like cyber attacks and disinformation. And I think this can be seen from the vantage point of the source, right? If this is coming in from non-state actor, then yeah, by all means, call it a crime, right? But if it is deliberate, and if it is targeting, for example, sir, uh, government data, for instance, public safety, public health, if it is targeting, for example, if it is undermining, for example, the credibility of your government, undermining your elections, then there's something more sinister, I think. And in my paper, I call this convergence, consistent with how Martin Libicki described it, the combination of offensive cyber and disinformation. Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. You could see why we really appreciate Florence and Facts Asia for bringing this topic to us and working with us on this topic. There's so much going on, and you could see how countries are working through these issues and how the United States is trying to work and partner with many of these countries on these issues. So be sure to read these papers. Be sure to join us again for the next 2 webinars. Please join me in thanking our panelists and Florence and Facts Asia for all their work. And thank you for joining us, whether you're staying up late with us here in the United States or early in the morning in Asia. We really appreciate you joining us, and thanks for all your support. Have a great one, everybody. Thanks again.